What challenges face the patient and analyst in constructing the analytic space? How can the analyst navigate the interplay of intense emotional dynamics to enable meaningful transformation? In this article, titled The Analyst and the Patient, Building a Space for Thinking, Alberto Carrión García de Parada delves into the intricate process of building a shared analytic space. Drawing on his extensive experience in child and adolescent psychoanalysis and parent-infant psychotherapy, he examines the dynamic interplay of transference and countertransference, highlighting the analyst's active role in containing, disturbing emotional and mental content. Integrating classical theories with contemporary developments, the article references key figures such as Wilfred Bion and León Grinberg to explore the evolution of the analytic process through shared emotional storms and the gradual dismantling of initial patient resistances. By emphasizing the importance of the analyst's reverie and countertransference awareness, the article underscores how the analytic setting can serve as a transformative framework for emotional containment and psychic development. Alberto Carrión García de Parada, training psychoanalyst and president of the Madrid Psychoanalytical Association, is specialized in child and adolescent psychoanalysis with a particular focus on parent-infant psychotherapy, and he has also directed the APM's Children and Adolescent Department. An accomplished author, his publications include significant contributions to the field of child development and psychoanalytic practice, such as The Child Psychoanalyst, Transformations in the Mother-Baby Bond in 2018, Frame and Reverie in 2020, and contributed to the book Interrogated Paternality, edited by the APM in 2020. I am Gaetano Pellegrini with Talks on Psychoanalysis, the IPA podcast devoted to topics published worldwide in the IPA Society journals and congresses featuring the original voices of the authors. This podcast series, published by the International Psychoanalytical Association, is part of the activities of the IPA Communication Committee. This episode has been produced in collaboration with Ana Maria Martin Solar, editing and post-production Massimiliano Guerrieri. And to stay informed about the latest podcast releases, please sign up today. Please consider attending the biennial IPA Congress, which will occur in Lisbon in July 2025. Come, learn and interact in person with the world psychoanalytic community. Find out more at our website ipa.world.
In these reflections, I would like to focus my attention on the complexity of the analytical experience and the challenge that analyst and patient face in constructing this space. This complexity implies that the analyst might have to be active from the first interviews or sessions, making some observation or interpretation when certain content arises, such as resistances and defenses that put at risk opening the field and continuing to explore in an analytical space. When the latter occurs, not only is the analyst's analytical function at risk of being nullified, but there is a part of the patient's mind that suffers and seeks help. This part of the mind is also threatened with being ignored by another part of the mind identified with an object that does not listen. In my experience, there are psychoanalytic treatments that can be started from the beginning with an analytical setting of 3 or 4 weekly sessions with other patients in whom persecutory and claustrophobic anxieties predominate, I observe this not to be the case. This analysis must be built on the basis of interpretative work with the patient to help him achieve a certain capacity for insight that favors the emergence of a greater desire to know himself and a decrease in his fears of the analytical relationships, thus making it possible to move on to a setting with a greater number of sessions. In these cases, I think it is important for the analyst to listen to his countertransference and be guided by his intuition. With some of these patients, I have had the countertransferential feeling that proposing 3 or 4 sessions from the beginning would have awakened even more persecutory fantasies that had a high risk of being acted out and leading the patient to flee from the treatment. However, experience has taught me that giving time and tolerating the patient's pace favors the development of a more open and receptive space that leads to an analytical setting. Patient and analyst will approach each other, especially in the first encounters, with some concern about what may arise and how this bond will develop. The patient will go to the analyst with the expectation that his overwhelming anxiety, his discomfort, his feeling of vulnerability, his negative mood, and/or his lack of enthusiasm can be mitigated and contained. The analyst will participate with the desire to understand and help the patient. These encounters will find the meaning within the transference-countertransference link that will be represented through an unconscious fantasy. The analyst will have to be prepared and receptive without memory and without desire to be able to contain the patient's communications, paying special attention to his countertransference. In my reflections on the topic I intend to address, I will rely on my expertise and experiences with patients without referring specially to any of them. I will focus my attention on the intense emotions, some of them very disturbing and unsettling, that the analyst and the patients have to deal with for an analytical process to develop. León Grinberg, an Argentine psychoanalyst who was also a prominent member of the Madrid Psychoanalytical Association, to which I belong, stated that psychoanalysis is two-way street. He also stated that the basic fantasy of a session is not defined by the analyst's mere understanding of the patient's fantasy, but is something that is built within the relationship as a pair, even though each member has a different role. It is something that is created between both people at the time of the session. Technical developments in psychoanalysis have occurred as analysts have expanded their field of intervention. A greater diversity of patients, a wider age range, and analysis involving more than one individual. This evolution has allowed us to better identify the different mental functions within the patients, the way of bonding, the types of interpretations, and the most appropriate moments to use them. In this regard, N. Alvarez has spoken about the levels of calibration of interpretation. Paying attention to how patients listen to us, what Heidegger Feinberg called listening to listening, is also fundamental as it helps the analyst understand how the patient uses interpretations and as well as to assess their appropriateness. Wilfred Bion points out that an emotional storm will occur in the analytical encounter. He said, if they make sufficient contact to be aware of each other, or even sufficient to be unaware of each other, an emotional state is produced by the conjunction of these two individuals, and the resultant disturbance is hardly likely to be regarded as necessarily an improvement on the state of affairs had they never met at all. And he concludes that perhaps the two parties to this storm may decide to make the best of a bad job. Various ideas are implicit in these interesting reflections by Bion. On the one hand, both identities come into play in these encounters, that of the analyst and that of the patient. I wonder if, when Bion refers to the contact between the two, he is actually suggesting that the analyst will connect as much with the conflicts and anxieties of his patient as with his defensive organization. On the other hand, it also highlights that going through these stormy states is part of the change and development of the analytical process that involves the analytical pair. I think that when analyst and patient meet in the first interview, it is not only the analyst who will try to get to know the patient, but there will be a mutual exploration. The analyst will listen and observe and look at himself through his countertransference. In turn, the patient will develop feelings about how he feels when talking about himself and how he experiences the analyst listening to him based on the way he does so and the interventions he carries out. In these encounters, words will be accompanied by other nonverbal elements and expressions such as gestures, rhythm, pause, and silence, tones, or movements that will generate a package of sensations and impressions that will give meaning to what both participants have experienced. The analyst will have to be receptive and open to what the patient is bringing. There will be times when one may feel confused, disoriented, lost, or overwhelmed by emotions and sensations that have been projected onto him. These may be difficult situations, but at the same time, they may be hopeful as they will allow for a more genuine skin-to-skin encounter in which the patient will share experiences that are sometimes very traumatic and will find through this channel the way of expressing themselves. Sigmund Freud had the brilliant intuition for understanding how the patient brings painful and traumatic experiences to the present. He said that, in general, nothing is remembered that is forgotten and repressed, and that memories appears in the present through actions, an action whose content is unconscious. He stated that repetition is the transference of the forgotten past, a past that appears in the present and that I think is waiting to be transformed with the help of the psychoanalyst. I have always found Herbert Rosenfeld's words regarding projective identification very enlightening and interesting. He said, when a patient is trying to push unbearable mental content into the analyst, he is also compelling him to share the unpleasant experiences. An attack on an analyst who is believed to be aloof and not caring may be a form of communication with a faint hope that the analyst, through being forced to share the patient's experience, may find a better solution to the problems than the patient. Such behavior by a patient is frequently misunderstood and interpreted by some therapists as being entirely aggressive. Like Bion, this author highlights that it is essential to recognize the communicative element of projective identification linked to empathy. Rosenfeld does not deny the aggressive element, but highlights the message that is conveyed along with the desire to connect and be helped. Therefore, it points to the object and its container function, and to the problems that occur when it is not receptive, failing in its reverie function. Focusing now on the container function of the object, I wish to highlight the analyst's difficult task. Sometimes very intense transferences occur which have a very disturbing effect on one's mind and are not easy to deal with. In others, we are not aware of this fact during the session and we can only realize it after the patient leaves, which is when we can think about both how we have felt in the countertransference and its meaning. In other circumstances, it takes much longer before the analyst can see and understand it. There are times, already in the first interviews, when we encounter situations that may require us to make certain observations or interventions. For example, this can occur in patients in whom we see a party that is very self-destructive and acts out. The analyst may be invaded by fantasies in which he is, for example, thrown into the trash, abandoned, ignored, etc., and may be shocked and disconcerted in the countertransference. These are difficult times that can cause great concern. As the interview or session progresses, the patient may refer to traumatic situations, such as long absences of parents in the first year of life, rejection, minor illness within the family, or losses. These are situations that help us understand the countertransference feelings that are the result of projective identification, the objective of which is to get rid of traumatic experiences that are communicated to the analyst. These traumatic experiences leave the patients with great resentment and distrust that can seriously hinder the analytical bond. It is important for the analyst to be attentive to this functioning, since, in my experience, this type of patients tends to act out. The patient consulting us is usually preceded by other previous consultations that have been abandoned shortly thereafter. These endings make me think that this new consultation runs the same risk of ending in a thanatotic repetition. For the reason I have described, I believe that the analyst cannot remain a simple observer. You have to take the risk of verbalizing what you observe, guided by your own intuition and analytical conviction, so that the patient has the opportunity to not repeat the same story. In the case of patients like those I have described, it is important to approach from the adult side the inner child who feels rejected, abandoned, ignored, resentful, furious, with a desire for revenge, or, for example, defending himself from behind an omnipotent shield. This is also a part of the mind that wants to be found. The analyst's work becomes even more complex when other characters intervene in the consultation, as occurs when we attend the babies and small children together with the parents, or to children, adolescents, families, or couples, where the different characters may be representing different roles or mental functions. It also happens when we talk about very disorganized patients who require the accompaniment and participation of other professionals and the support of family members. The experience of treating young children together with their parents are very enriching. They help the child while promoting understanding for the parents who participate in the experience. Although the child plays the main role in the treatment, parents have a space where they can bring expectations, doubts, fears, and concerns that may arise. This experience helps generate identification processes with the analyst, both in the child and in his parents. In this sense, it is essential to see how the analyst relates to the child, as well as the understanding he has of the game's actions, movement, gestures, and other types of expressions that will allow parents to know the children better. They are transformative experience in communication within the family. The situation that lead to the child's consultation can often be clarified in the first interviews, as occurs in certain cases where a child has been diagnosed with autism. I have observed on repeated occasions how this assessment has been carried out, taking as a reference the symptomatology such as not playing, verbal language being limited to a few words, being absent, disconnected, or not paying attention. Already in the first joint interview with these children and their parents, I was able to see gestures such as glances or movements that suggested that this was not an autistic child. With the information provided by the parents and the observations of the child present, I was able to think out loud with the parents about how I was seeing their child. These children, when they are not autistic, show a certain sensitivity in the gazes, in the approach to their parents, or react, even if only very slightly, to the bond with the analyst through some object, such as a ball, which makes us think that they have greater capacity for relating. Based on the analyst's observation, a space opens up that allows the parents and the child to think about why his development may have stopped. This often leads to traumatic situation in the relationship between the child and his most representative features, situations that can lead the child to a state of depression and a lack of vitality. In my experience, when these situations are detected and parents are receptive, it produces a very positive and stimulating effect on the child. Isabel Luzuriaga, a child psychoanalyst in my society, said that there were children who were dull and depressed, who seemed to be waiting for a living object to come along and recognize them. I agree with her. It is amazing to see how these children react when they have an analytical space. In my experience, it can be important to share this space with the parents at first. I think that to a certain extent, the same thing happens to parents when they discover a child, their son, whom they did not expect to meet, thus giving them back the hope and the desire to connect with him in a different way. Recently, during a casual conversation with several analysts in training, I was surprised by the lack of confidence I observed in them to believe in their own ability to construct an analytic setting. We talk about the fundamental role that the analyst plays in the construction of an analysis and how important supervisions are because they help us see how often there can be internal obstacles which are the analyst's own resistance to coming into contact with certain areas of the patient's mind that are very disturbing. Various analysts have highlighted how the analyst's anguish is not only about the patients abandoning the treatment, but also about the patient staying. Giving more space to sessions favors more intense and disturbing transferences that involve us as analysts to a greater extent. As Bion suggests in the quote I referred to earlier, the analyst has to tolerate going through a certain disturbance or emotional storm in order for evolution and change to occur. I would like to end these reflections with a beautiful and lively description by Stefan Zweig in one of his books, 24 Hours in the Life of a Woman. It describes a situation captured by the protagonist of the story, which in my opinion has some similarities to the experiences that we can go through in our countertransference when we analyze patients. This observation and the young man's fatal outcome make me think about the value of the analytic setting in containing overwhelming anxieties and giving them meaning. The protagonist, a woman, watched a young man playing at the casino, being fascinated and terrified at the same time by what she perceives, a man about to collapse. I was surprised to hear a very strange noise just opposite me, a cracking like breaking joints. I was stupefied. At that moment I saw two hands. I think I was startled. Two hands such as I had never seen before, clasped together like enraged animals, clenched one into the other. They were hands of rare beauty. I continued to look at them all evening, even marveling at those extraordinary, most singular hands, but what surprised me so much at first was the passion, the madly passionate expressiveness. I saw at once that here was someone quite overflowing with tension, whose passion was pressing together in his fingertips to prevent it exploding outwards. For never before and never since have I seen such articulate hands, where every muscle was a mouth and passion burst forth almost palpably from the pore. And again I flinched, for that face expressed the same unveiled, fantastically exuberant language as the hands. I think that this young player can be a literary example of the suffering that some of our patients have to deal with, and the opportunity that arises when they come to our consultations and can develop an analytical process that helps them find greater understanding of themselves. In these reflections, I have wanted to highlight the value of the analytic setting and the supportive role played by our earlier interventions in creating this analytic space that offers the patient an idea of a more hopeful future.